Now that we've discussed the basic structures of the institutions of state government, one final thing we need to look at to understand Arizona's politics are the measures put in the Constitution by the framers to ensure that Arizonans enjoyed several options for direct democracy. Now, let me take a minute here and explain the difference between direct and representative democracy. Direct democracy is where all of the people governed have a say in the policies that they're being governed by. We could bring to mind the New England town that doesn't have a mayor. They would meet once or twice a year, and the entire town would get together and discuss whether or not to hire a dog catcher and what salary they ought to pay that dog catcher, and maybe what color the uniform ought to be for that dog catcher. And the entire town discusses and debates that issue. And then they might talk about their school system, or they might talk about the speed limit, or whether to put speed bumps on a particular road. And the entire town has this conversation and then votes on these measures. Representative democracy is where people elect others who then make those kinds of decisions. The minutia of government is determined by an elected representative. So we can contrast the New England town with your typical Arizona town, where citizens vote and elect a mayor. They elect city council members, and then those city council members hold a meeting where they discuss whether or not to hire a dog catcher and what salary to pay the dog catcher, and perhaps even what color the dog catcher's uniform ought to be. The citizens aren't engaged in that conversation. They've granted the authority to those elected officials to make those decisions for them. And that's what representative democracy is. Now, direct democracy usually only occurs in very small localities because of the logistics involved. I mean, you can imagine if the city of Phoenix decided to have a plebiscite on whether or not they should hire a dog catcher. Tens of thousands of people might show up for that meeting. It's unwieldy. And so representative democracy allows for an efficient government and a powerful government that nevertheless is grounded in the consent of the governed. Now, the founders of the Arizona Constitution, again, informed by their progressive notions, argued that your everyday citizen should have more of a say in their government than representative democracy normally allows for. Recall that the territorial governors were carpetbaggers appointed as friends of the president, not people who actually lived here. And the territorial legislature was often captured by the mining and corporate interests that were so powerful in the early state. And so they wanted to have a mechanism for everyday citizens to have a say in the policies that governed them. Now, these provisions, like the initiative, the recall, the referendum, were included in the Constitution. I should note here that states whose constitutions were written prior to the Progressive Era, meaning their constitutions were in place before the late 1800s, do not have these elements in them. Or if they have them, they're much more constrained than they are in Arizona. So as a Western state, and as one of the last states to actually write a constitution, our Constitution has more direct democracy potential than most other states in the Union. As a result, Arizona has more initiatives than almost any other state. anytime Arizonans go to a statewide ballot, is guaranteed to have a handful, if not a whole raft, of ballot propositions that they have to vote on. Many of these ballot propositions originate as citizen initiatives. The way the initiative process works is an interest group or a group of citizens decide there ought to be a law, and so they will write down the wording of the law that they want enacted. They then, rather than give that to a legislator to try to get it passed through the legislature, they would then instead go to the Secretary of State and get certified as an initiative. They then would get signature forms and go around and collect signatures from registered voters. It numbers in the thousands. It's quite a few signatures that need to be collected. If they gather enough signatures, they then can go back to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State will verify that those signatures are indeed valid, and if so, the Secretary of State will certify that initiative as a ballot proposition to be included in the next general election. Now, you can't these days go to a library or a mall or a parade without being surrounded by petition gatherers, because several groups take advantage of this initiative process to bypass the legislature and have the Arizona voters directly pass legislation. Most of these ballots obtain their signatures through professional signature gatherers. The going rate is usually $1 to $2 per signature that they're able to get. This potentially causes problems, as the motive of the signature gatherer may not be the same as the Secretary of State. Their objective is to get as many signatures as possible so they can earn money. So that's one reason why the Secretary of State has to verify that those signatures are indeed valid signatures of people who are registered to vote in Arizona. Now, once the wording for the proposition has been approved, it is placed on the ballot, and the voters then vote. And if the voters vote in favor of the initiative, it immediately becomes law. It does not require any action by the legislature, nor does the governor sign it. It immediately becomes law. Now, one thing to realize about the propositions in Arizona is that we have placed handcuffs on the legislature. They are not allowed to revise these initiatives. Now, this stems from the 1994 case where a ballot proposition was put out there that would legalize marijuana. And most of the signatures gatherers didn't tell people that the proposition was legalizing marijuana. They told people it was a proposition to put violent offenders in jail for longer sentences. And that indeed was one of the provisions. And the way the proposition was going to pay for that was by decriminalizing marijuana and releasing all of those who are in prison on drug charges. And that would then open up lots of room in the prisons for violent offenders to serve longer sentences. So the signatures were gathered, the proposition was on the ballot, and it actually passed. Again, most people thought they were voting to increase sentences for violent offenders. After the proposition passed and the news reported that Arizona had legalized marijuana, the legislature immediately in the next session passed a law removing that statute from the books and overturned the proposition. The response to that was a new initiative that said that the legislature cannot change the wording or the intent of a proposition ballot unless it has a 3/4 majority in both houses. Realize that a 3/4 majority is almost impossible under the best of circumstances. And if you recall the way the Arizona legislature operates, party caucuses craft almost all of the legislation that passes through, which means that the parties don't work together at all in the Arizona legislature, and so it's impossible to achieve a supermajority as a result. This means that all subsequent initiatives are locked in, that when a voter-approved proposition passes, the legislature can't touch it. Now, that has complicated the efforts on the part of the legislature to balance the budget, because much of the budget has been carved out by voter initiatives mandating certain spending. The legislature cannot undo that spending without having the voters vote again to remove that. So the initiative process is an example of direct democracy where the citizens decide what the laws are going to be. And then in Arizona's case, the legislature can't touch those laws. Another form of direct democracy is the referendum. The referendum is where the legislature passes a law, but the law does not take effect. Instead, all the law does is put a measure on the ballot for the next general election. The voters then vote on that measure, and if the voters approve it, it immediately becomes law without the governor's signature. And if the voters don't approve it, well, obviously it fails. It's useful to ask the question, why would the legislature do this? Because it takes a majority vote to create a referendum. So why doesn't the legislature simply pass the law with the majority vote that they are enjoying? There's a couple reasons why the legislature passes referenda. One is to pass off tough decisions to the voters. When there's a decision that would require a legislator to cast a vote that would expose them to a tough re-election campaign, for example, creating a tax increase. Voting in favor of a tax is political death. It's a good way to lose your job as a legislator. So instead, they could pass that decision off on the voters. Another example might be rezoning a territory, or passing a law that prohibits hunting on a particular area, or, as is going to be the case in the upcoming election, pass a law that makes it so that unions have to have an open election when a workplace is unionizing. Now, the legislature could have just passed that law, but by making it a referenda, it becomes a citizen issue, and the legislators are able to say, look, I would have never voted for a tax increase. All I'm doing is giving the citizens an opportunity to decide yes or no. And so it's a way to pass off the tough decisions. Another reason for why a legislature would do a referendum is to take advantage of that 94 initiative that says that the legislature can't alter a measure that has been passed by a ballot proposition unless it has a supermajority, which, as I said, is a near impossibility in the Arizona legislature, the way the politics run in our legislature. So, if a legislature were to pass a law by a simple majority, they could indeed pass the law, but then a future legislature could pass a new law which would undo the law that you've passed. However, if instead of passing a law, you use your majority to put a proposition on the ballot, and the public then votes in favor of that proposition, that law is now locked in. It's set in stone. A future legislature can't touch it, can't alter it, unless they can muster that 3/4 majority, which again is nearly impossible. So there is a strategic reason for why the legislature would pass off a decision to the voters in a ballot proposition. Finally, anything that involves an increase in taxes, the state constitution mandates that those tax increases have to go to the voters. So the legislature can pass it, but it doesn't take effect until the voters have voted on it. So they're constitutionally required to use the referendum if it's a tax increase. So these are ways that the legislature can either abdicate or utilize the direct democracy provisions of the ballot propositions. Now, between the citizen initiatives and the legislature's referenda, Arizona ballots are often quite crowded. Now, you can understand something about the proposition, the origin of a proposition, by the numbers that are attached to it. If the proposition has a 100 in front of it, then that means that that proposition involves a constitutional amendment, whether it comes from the initiative or a referenda, that if that proposition is passed, the Arizona Constitution will be altered in whatever manner in which the proposition recommends that it is. Now, if there is a 200 in front of the number, then that means that it has reached the ballot through the referendum process. So the state legislature has written that proposition, and they're asking the voters to vote for that. If there is a 300, then that means that that proposition originated as a citizen initiative. So they signed the petitions and achieved enough signatures to be able to put it on the ballot. Now, if there's a 400 by the number, that means it's a local issue of some kind, typically bond elections, or perhaps a city or county will have an issue that needs to be addressed by the general voting public. So those numbers can help you understand where these propositions are coming from. It's important to read through the voter information packets on these propositions to find out what they will do, because sometimes a no vote means yes and a yes vote means no, the way they're worded. So it's important to carefully review those propositions. The final form of direct democracy is the recall. Now, remember that President Taft vetoed the Constitution over the issue of judicial recall. Now, once the Constitution was established, the Arizona voters replaced that provision so that power to recall judges still exists. It's only been used a couple of times, though, so Taft need not have worried about it. But I want to differentiate between impeachment versus recall. Impeachment is when an elected body, a representative body, moves to remove a person from office. So if the legislature decides to remove someone from office, that's an impeachment. A recall is when the citizens act to remove that person from office, not the legislature. So a recall is initiated by a petition similar to a ballot proposition, and registered voters need to sign that petition saying that this public person needs to be eliminated. Once those signatures are verified, it then goes on the ballot, and the voters can vote to recall that official. Recalls are rare, but they do occasionally occur. But it is another example that the founders of the Constitution wanted that tool to be available to the voting public in case their government ceased to work in their interests and was only working in corporate or personal interests of the politicians. Arizona's Constitution sets the state's political institutions up in a way that is similar in institutional form to those around the nation. Yet our institutions are unique as a result of Arizona's history. The impact of the Progressive Era's philosophies on the founders means that we have an executive branch that is very weak compared to other states and counties, with power divided amongst many elected officials. We have a highly partisan legislature, and we have, as citizens, many opportunities to engage in direct democracy and decide the direction the state will take. As a citizen of Arizona, it is important to understand these processes and constantly pay attention to what is going on at the state and local level. Power in Arizona is so spread out, and the opportunities for citizen action are so prevalent that change is constant on the Arizona political scene. This means that for your policy preferences to take place, you need to be ever vigilant and watch the political processes around you. This presentation is courtesy of Brian Dilley. I'm the speaker, and I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College, a college of the Maricopa Community College District in Mesa, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.